Was it just too soon for cruising? How did these outbreaks actually happen? Hi there, I'm Ilana from the website and blog lifewellcruise.com, and today I'm going to talk about the outbreaks on recent cruise ships. And as we all know, there have been some outbreaks on cruise ships as they have restarted in Europe. And of course, while we were super happy this was all happening, that they had restarted, we're not very happy with the news of these outbreaks. But I'm going to go into that information to see where cruise lines really went wrong. One cruise line in particular, and it is a really, really big deal. It's actually quite serious. But where the other cruise lines, well, there can be some silver lining because there's some things that they actually did really well given the circumstance. So before I get into that information, I did want to mention that if you do like this video, if you find it helpful, informative, or enjoyable in any way, please do give it a thumbs up. I really do appreciate it. And of course, please consider sharing with somebody else who you think might value the information and subscribing to the channel. So let's get started. So let's start with the worst outbreak on cruise ships right now, and that is the Hurtigruten cruise line, which unfortunately on a recent cruise has 41 crew members who have tested positive for this virus and another 21 passengers, and it could even get larger from there. Every day it seems like the news is just a little bit worse. Now, a little bit of information about Hurtigruten. This is a cruise line that sails up and down the coast of Norway, and it really visits several Norwegian ports. They consider these voyages to be expedition cruises, and this cruise line is very well loved. It's been sailing in Norway for over 100 years. And an interesting little fact is that they are not a member of the Cruise Line International Association, CLIA. They were up until 2016, and they decided not to renew their membership at that point. So if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering, how did it get this bad? What exactly happened? Well, it turns out as I was doing my research that there were a number of things that went wrong because the company didn't follow protocols and procedures. And we all know that cruise lines have set out very strict procedures to follow, but if they don't follow them, what good are they? So let's go over the series of things that went wrong for this cruise line. So the first thing that happened was the cruise line was informed of a passenger that was on a previous sailing that had later been diagnosed with this virus. Now, they opted not to inform passengers, and they actually sort of disagreed that this passenger may have had it on the cruise. They felt that there was no really proof of that. And this is according to some articles from the Norwegian press, which I will link down below. Now, according to the Norway Institute of Health, the agreement with the public health authorities is that the cruise line is supposed to inform passengers immediately. So they're actually quite upset in Norway that this was not done. So secondly, not long after this happened, on the cruise itself, it turned out that a couple of crew members, well, they took ill. They became sick. And so they were confined to their cabin. They were quarantined, if you will. However, the cruise line believed that there was no reason to suspect that this was the virus. They didn't have the symptoms, apparently. Now, I have to say, where I live, I know that the symptoms just seem to be getting larger and larger. Taste of smell, runny nose, the kitchen sink. It could be anything. It could be asymptomatic. So it does seem unbelievable that they didn't assume that they really needed to test and make sure, and maybe even quarantine the whole ship at that point just to make sure. But they did not do that. And instead what they did is they isolated those crew members, and then at the end of the cruise, they let all of the passengers go into the town of Tromsø on their merry way, going home, going to restaurants, wherever they were going. During that time, 4 members were actually brought to hospital and diagnosed with this virus. So now they had to track down all of those passengers that were on that cruise ship. And of course, they also had to test all of the crew. And that's how so far 41 crew members and 21 passengers have tested positive. But of course, this creates a big problem because many of the passengers have gone off to their home, or they could have even spread it if they had this virus into the other towns that they went to all along this cruise, because this was not a cruise to nowhere. It did actually have several different stops. And now the third thing has to do with how crew members are coming onto the cruise ship to start working. And basically what the protocol is that when crew leaves their home country, they're supposed to be tested there and then tested again in Norway and then isolated for a certain amount of days before they start work. And of course that they're tested negative by that point. Now, crew from the Philippines in particular, what had happened is they arrived on the cruise ship, and while awaiting test results, were allowed to continue their duties on the cruise ship, which is absolutely against the protocol. And of course, doesn't make any sense because they were mixing with people on the cruise ships while they were waiting for those amount of days to pass. So that absolutely could have resulted in them having this virus and spreading it around the cruise ship. As you can imagine, there are actually repercussions to this. Firstly, the CEO of the company has said that he takes full responsibility for this. They definitely had some missteps and they're going to be looking into that. As well, the COO has actually temporarily stepped down from his position, and he was actually on a recent cruise, and there are some reports that he was on this cruise itself. There's actually also a police probe or an investigation into all of this that occurred. And it really is very serious. They say that they put their passengers and the crew health first and foremost, but clearly the passengers' health was put in jeopardy. The crew that truly need these jobs, their health was put into jeopardy. Their lives perhaps was put into jeopardy. The towns in Norway, they were really not very responsible with the way they handled this. And lastly, but still very importantly, the reputation of the cruise industry. Although it's not only their responsibility, they certainly did have a responsibility to follow the protocols. And it certainly does, unfortunately, not look very good for the cruise industry, even though this is just one cruise line. Do you agree? Do you think differently on this? Let me know in the comments below if they owed a little bit to the cruise industry to be a little bit more vigilant, since they were one of the early cruise lines to sail. Now, let's get on to the other information about other cruise lines that did have cases, but handled it much differently, and I think have been good examples. And at the same time, there are things to learn from what happened and how things were handled. So now let's chat about a few cruise lines that had problems, but did do everything, well, right. So the first one is Paul Gauguin. Now, they did have one passenger that tested positive on their cruise ship. And just to give you a little bit of information about Paul Gauguin, they are a gorgeous small luxury cruise line that is sailing in the islands of French Polynesia. Just absolutely beautiful cruises, and they're on my wish list. So what happened was they were sailing for several weeks successfully with local people, and this was the first cruise that was actually sailing with international passengers. So there was one passenger diagnosed on the cruise ship with this virus, and what happened was, as per the protocol, this passenger was tested prior to getting on her flight from the US, and then she boarded the cruise ship, and then only after boarding the cruise ship did she receive the results of the test that she took when she arrived in French Polynesia. And unfortunately, that test showed that she was positive and likely asymptomatic. So the cruise ship itself, all of the passengers were actually quarantined at that point. The passengers were disembarked from the cruise ship, but all protocols are being followed. Now, after that, we heard about another cruise ship, and they had a very similar circumstance. This was out of the United States in Alaska. The cruise line Uncruise, they had a very small cruise ship. They were actually sailing with, I believe, 36 or 37 passengers, so very small. They took also every precaution so that things would go well. But unfortunately, a passenger who had tested negative before taking his flight, as he was supposed to, was tested in Alaska, boarded the cruise, and then once on the cruise ship, well, they found out that he had indeed tested positive for this virus. So again, I assume probably somebody that was asymptomatic. Now, in the case of this cruise, what happened was the passengers were all quarantined. They were all isolated to the cabins, as were the crew, and they made their way back to Juneau, where everybody was being quarantined on land, as they had already agreed upon with the government of Alaska. So they did follow the protocol. There is a bit of a question as to the testing prior to getting onto the cruise ship and then getting the results after. So I do think this is something the cruise lines can learn from, and this probably isn't the way things should go, but it's hard to know exactly why this happened. Now, other cases, there were 3 other cruise ships, all in Europe. There was an Aida cruise ship, a Costa cruise ship, and a Mein Schiff cruise ship that all had crew that tested positive for this virus, but before they were sailing and before any passengers were on. They followed the protocol. Crew is to be tested prior to arriving in the country. So whether it's Italy or Germany, they were tested, the crew back in their home country. It could have been the Philippines or it could have been another country. And they were tested again once they arrived in the port city. At that point, they would have to wait several days being isolated for the results to come in. And unfortunately, several crew members on each of those different cruise lines had tested positive. So all in all, though, they followed the protocols. They found out that crew were positive and they did not sail with them. And so they were able to manage the situation. Now, in reality, we're learning that this virus is very complicated. And even in our own lives, maybe in our own communities, we're seeing how people can get this virus, whether they go to work, whether they go to school, whether they go to summer camp, restaurants, anywhere. So it really can be anywhere. And of course, it can also make its way, unfortunately, to cruise ships. It really is how it's handled that is most important. So there is a question that comes up, I think now, which is when crew or passengers are tested in their home country and then they arrive in the next country and they are found to be positive, how is that happening? I'm not personally sure about how that's happening, if it's testing itself or if they're catching this along the way in their travels, maybe on their plane, on the plane. Let me know in the comments what you think. We'll probably know more and learn more as time passes, and I'm sure the cruise lines that haven't yet sailed are learning from this and adjusting. Do you think it might just be too soon for international travel? Could that be the problem? Let me know, please, in the comments below, as well as what you think about Hurtigruten and what should actually happen there. Now, if you did like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. I really do appreciate it. And please consider subscribing to the channel with your notifications on so you can catch our very next video. Now, I am on Instagram and I am on Facebook, and I'd love to connect with you there. Thanks for watching and happy future cruising.